Good evening. Nice, it works. Just wanted to say a quick note about VBS yesterday. Mainly just wanted to thank everyone who brought your kids, your grandkids, your neighbors' kids, some kids you picked up somewhere, wherever they came from. We're thankful you brought them. And thankful especially to the teachers. The teachers just absolutely killed it this year, as always. And I just heard a lot of positivity from all the kids and the parents. And that goes right back to our teachers and to Lou and her team for all the work that they put in with the food. A special shout out to Callie for doing the Lion King scene back behind there. That's magic. That was really cool. And also Missy and Letitia helped with that too. And just all the decorations from all the teachers were amazing. So just wanted to say thank you, and I'll talk with you VBS helpers again after the service just really quickly. But one of these is not like the other, so just wanted to point out that one of us there was older. I promise, more mature. Okay, I want to finish off our thoughts tonight by talking about exile. This is the third part in a three-part series, thinking about exile. And it's the second part of the last two sermons, I guess, talking about the ethic of an exile. What is the moral code of Christians living in exile in our world? How should we live in a complicated and changing moral landscape like ours? So wherever you may feel like you are in exile, if it's in our culture, with the political landscape, if it's in your family, if it's in your friend group, your job, your school, your church, whatever it is, if you feel like you're in exile there, I hope that what we discuss tonight can help you navigate complicated moral decisions on how to treat other people and how to live in a world that's not always easy to navigate. Last week, we talked about Jeremiah and Daniel. We talked about how Jeremiah prescribed and then Daniel lived out this peaceful, subversive, nonviolent ethic where in his life, he was loyal to Babylon, to this nation that had taken him into exile, had done terrible things to him, to his family, to his country. He was loyal to them, at least submissive to them. But he was also subversive. There were lines that he wouldn't cross. So Daniel is rocking. He's killing the exile game. He's doing great. But I want you to see this text, just one snapshot at Daniel's heart in exile. This is Daniel 9, verse 19. He's praying. He says, "O Lord, hear. O Lord, forgive. O Lord, pay attention and act. Delay not for your own sake, O my God, because your city and your people are called by your name." So Daniel is doing about as well as he can be doing in exile. But he also desperately wants to go home. If you read the rest of this prayer, if you read the book of Daniel, you'll see that. In spite of how well he seems to be doing in serving God in this complicated situation, he wants to go home. And eventually, his people would go home. But their land would never really be the same again. Because even after they went home, they were always ruled by someone. First it was the Persians, and then it was the Greeks. And by the time we get to Jesus, nothing has changed. In Jesus' day, Rome was the superpower. So let's talk about Jesus. This is where I want us to begin tonight, because this is where it all begins and really where it ends for us. As Christians, this is what we're all about. I think sometimes it's easy to get caught up in the Christian walk and thinking that Christianity is about being the church or about doing church or it's about converting my coworkers or it's about, and we could go on and on. And those things are not against Christianity, right? That's part of being a Christian. But what being a Christian is about at its root, at its core, is being a follower of Jesus. Like Dennis talked about this morning, being a disciple of Jesus. A disciple is a learner. It's a follower. So as Christians, as people who are following after Jesus, we're trying to be like him. So how did Jesus live in exile here on earth? And what can we take away from that in our lives? In his day, like I said, the oppressive power was Rome. And Rome made the lives of Jesus and his people very hard. And like always, you have these two alternatives, where on the one hand, some Israelites went the violent, rebellious route of revolt. They wanted to throw off Rome. Some other Jews took the second path, one of compromise, just totally giving in to Rome's culture and its gods, just totally becoming Roman. Those are the two kind of obvious, I guess, alternatives. And people in Jesus' day, if you read the historical records, they went down both those paths. But Jesus continues the ethic of Jeremiah and of Daniel, and he cuts across the path of revolt and compromise, and he carries on Daniel's subversive loyalty. So first of all, violent aggression was never on the table for Jesus. Multiple times, his people tried to crown him king, tried to crown him as the one who was going to throw Rome off as a military leader. But he wouldn't accept it. That wasn't on the table for him. This violent revolt wasn't what Jesus was all about. So he told his followers to love and pray for and bless their enemies. If a Roman soldier who is your enemy commands you to pick up his heavy bag that he could carry much better than you can, if he commands you to pick it up and walk a mile with him, then you walk 2 with him. Be loyal, even to Rome. But then also, Jesus was arrested for speaking up against the powers of his day. He critiqued their idolatry of power, and they killed him for it. So, followers of Jesus, also be subversive. He continued this subversive loyalty of Daniel. And I want you to turn with me to Matthew 22. In this text, I think we find a story and a phrase that captures Jesus' subversive loyalty, his loyal subversion, and what that looks like in real life. There's this famous story here in Matthew 22 where Jesus comes into Jerusalem, which is the epicenter of his people. Jerusalem was the holy city. And he comes into it and he's acting like a king. He looks like a conqueror and everybody's treating him like one, and it looks like something's about to go down. It looks like Jesus is about to take on the powers that be in Jerusalem. And the people in power obviously don't like that. They like the way that things are. And so they're trying to figure out a way to get rid of whatever's about to happen, to avoid it, to get rid of this pest named Jesus. And in verse 15, it says that they're plotting how to entangle him in his words. So this is their chosen route. They're trying to trip Jesus up in what he says, to turn the people against him. So one of them brings this coin to Jesus. And in verse 17, he asks, "Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Now, this question was not asked in good faith. Verse 18 says that Jesus was aware of their malice. So they're not actually wanting a response from Jesus that they can start a discussion with. They're trying to trip him up. And they're doing that by asking, should we pay the imperial tax to our oppressors? That's what this is about. This is about Rome, this big enterprise, military enterprise, oppressing the Jews, which is a smaller population of people. They're taking heavy taxes from them. So they're asking Jesus, okay, Jesus, do we just give in? Do we compromise with Rome? Do we give them what they want? Do we just roll over? Or do we revolt? I mean, we're God's people. We have God on our side. So should we revolt? Like I said, you had people in Jesus' day going both directions. And the Pharisees want him to pick a side. Either he's a compromiser or he's an instigator. And at that point, Jesus is painted into a corner and maybe his movement falls by the wayside, like so many had before him. And in verse 19, beginning, they bring him the coin, and Jesus asks for them to show him the coin. And they brought him a denarius. This is a denarius on the screen right now. So they bring him this type of coin, and Jesus says to them, "Whose likeness and inscription is this? Whose image and writing is on this coin?" They said, "Caesar's." Now, Jesus' response here is dense. It's like a riddle from Proverbs. If you've ever tried to sit down and read Proverbs, you're probably not going to understand like 50% of it because it's dense. You have to sit with it and think through it for a while. And that's kind of what happens here. Jesus says to them, "Therefore, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And notice this, when they heard it, they marveled. So they're trying to paint him into this category of either you're fully defined by Rome or you're really, really not. You're fully for Rome or you're fully against Rome. And Jesus cuts this path across the two. And when he says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's. So give the image of Caesar back to Caesar. This coin that bears the image of Caesar, give it back to Caesar with all that it represents. There was no mass media in the ancient world. At least the main mass media was coinage. They didn't have social media or TVs or cell phones. So the emperors of the day would spread their propaganda through putting their face on the coins. These coins were very powerful in that culture. So Jesus says, take that coin, everything it represents, the whole system, and give it right back to Caesar. Put that medal where it belongs. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's. He's loyal, right? But then the complementary statement to that, the next statement, give to God what belongs to God. Now this is a riddle, and it forces us to ask, what belongs to God? In other words, whose image is God's, or what is God's image on? And when we phrase it like that, I wanted to phrase it a little bit better than that because I don't want to give it away, but you're probably thinking now of Genesis 1 and verse 27. And for these people, all of these people were Jews. All of these people had grown up being force-fed the Jewish scriptures, the Old Testament. They knew the Old Testament from front to back. So in their minds are going to go to Genesis 1 and verse 27. Which says, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. So give to God what belongs to God. In other words, give yourself to God. Your whole allegiance, your whole life, give it to him. Because you are God's image. You belong to him. Now give yourself back to him. Give it to his system. Now this is what we saw Daniel doing. We saw him dressing like a Babylonian. We saw him taking on the clothing of a Babylonian, taking on the name of a Babylonian. And here we see the same thing where he says, give that coin back to the system in which it belongs. I'll pay your taxes with your coins. But the moment you think I'm going to define my identity and my ultimate values by the empire, I can't do that. Because I'm not mine to give away. I'm in the image of someone else. I belong to him. That's where my ultimate allegiance must lie. Now, this is how God's people have always been. And in many ways, to the outside world, this makes no sense. If you are a Babylonian looking at Daniel's life, the way that he conducts himself makes no sense. Daniel could have been so much more powerful, so much more successful than he was. And yet, he took the path of loyal subversion. He presents the Babylonian government with a paradox. How do we deal with this person who seems to be loyal to us, but at the same time is subversive to us? And Jesus presents the authorities in Jerusalem of his day with the same type of paradox, because he's not subtle in accusing them of being the Babylon of his day. There's this text in Matthew 26, and it's this next slide, where the high priest, who's this power-hungry and money-hungry sellout to Rome, they've arrested Jesus, and he's put him on trial, and he asks him this in front of everyone. He says, I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. And Jesus, what he does here, he quotes from the book of Daniel. And he says, you have said so. But I tell you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. So he's referencing this image from Daniel 7 about how God's people, Israel, are being trampled under Babylon's feet. But he takes that image, and notice what he does here. He applies it to the current situation. He equates himself to trampled Israel. And he equates the religious, political, spiritual leaders of Jerusalem, the people who would be here right now, the people in church. He equates them with Babylon, trampling on Israel underfoot. But the other side of the story from Daniel 7 is that God was coming to vindicate his people. His trampled people were not going to remain there for much longer. So Jesus is in Jerusalem itself. He's in the holy city, and he's equating what he's going through to exile. Jerusalem has become Babylon. And Jesus is not revolting. He's not compromising. He's being loyally subversive and subversively loyal. He's peacefully giving up his life to show there is a way that is different and better than the way of Babylon. It's the way of his kingdom. And that brings me to us, to you and to me. Because that way is the same way that Jesus calls his followers from back then all the way to today to live into. Turn to 1 Peter chapter 2, and let's sit with Peter for just a moment. Peter is one of Jesus' very earliest disciples. And at this point, he's later on in his life, and he's writing to some newer disciples in the faith. And he's advocating for this same ethic, this ethic of loyalty and subversion, this ethic that strives for peace, that's always in this give and take act with the culture that surrounds it. And Peter does some really weird things in this letter. For one, he writes about Babylon. He calls Babylon by name. And that might not seem weird to you because we're talking about Babylon, but that would be almost like me writing a letter to you and pretending that Babylon exists today. Because Babylon, the country, doesn't exist today, and it didn't exist in Peter's day in the same way. It hadn't existed for hundreds of years. But he refers to it as though it exists in that moment. Now, what's he doing here? This is in 1 Peter 5, by the way. He's saying, he's tapping into this train of thought that Jesus tapped into when he equated the Jerusalem rulers to Babylon, in the same train of thought that John is going to tap into throughout the book of Revelation in referring to Rome as Babylon. Babylon in the Bible has become this picture of oppressive, power-hungry power structures that hurt the people that are under them. Babylon has become Rome, and Rome has become Babylon. So, God's people in Peter's day were still under Babylonian exile. They were under Roman oppression, but they were still under Babylonian exile. It just looked different. And I think Peter would say that we are today as well, in a way that's very different and in a way that's, in many ways, less pressure-packed, and we're not being actively, violently persecuted, right? So we can appreciate so many things about our situation being different. But we still find ourselves in exile here on earth. And Peter writes for us in chapter 2, verses 11 and 12. He says, "Beloved, I urge you, as sojourners and exiles, to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, when they accuse you of being weird and being against the emperor, against the empire, when they do that, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation." So Peter is advocating for what God's people have always done, for living in such a way that they can see that you truly are for your city, your country, your family, your job, your friends, your church, your body, yourself, whatever it is, that you truly want the best for what happens here on earth. And this is not a front. This is not Peter, or definitely not me, calling for us to fake something, to engage in some type of manipulative tactic or deception tactic or anything else that would lead to people beginning to trust us just so we can turn it against them. That's not what Peter is calling for here. That's not love. He's calling for genuinely wanting what's good for the people of Babylon. He continues in verse 13, "Be subject, for the Lord's sake, to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or to governors, as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people." When I read this, I thought about this movie, Hacksaw Ridge. In Hacksaw Ridge, the main character joins the military, but he refuses to carry a gun. So he becomes a medic because he has this non-violence ethic that's partially informed by his faith. So he won't be violent to other people. And he won't carry a gun. So he becomes a medic. But they insist that he carries a gun. And he says, "No, I won't carry a gun because even if I have it, I'm not going to be shooting anyone with it. So why should I carry it?" And they say, "No, if you're not armed, you're a liability." And it becomes this big standoff where everyone starts to hate him. Because they say, "How can we really know that you're for us? How can we really know that you actually want what's best for us if you won't even protect us against our enemies?" and this is a spoiler, so if you want this movie not to be spoiled for you, don't listen to the next 10 seconds. But what happens in the movie is the battle comes, and long story short, he never, engages in violence, but he saves dozens of lives at great risk to his own life. And what happens is that they see that he really was for them the whole time. He really was for what is best for the people. He wanted to help people, to save people. But he wasn't going to engage in something that went against his ethic. Now, whether you share the nonviolence ethic in a way that looks like no guns, and because we're in Arkansas, most people in here probably don't, right? But whether you share that or not, I think we can take inspiration from this type of character. A type of character that says, I don't want to hurt anyone. I'm not here to hurt anyone in any way, physically, emotionally, spiritually, whatever it is. I want to be loyal to the people around me, truly to love my surroundings. But also, always to seek what's best, to think for myself, and to seek what's best for people, even if they don't realize what that might be for themselves in that moment. Because what these people realized is that he was actually more for them, maybe even than they were for themselves. Even more than they were for themselves, he was for them, because he wanted what was best for them, no matter what. Keep reading with me in 1 Peter 2. Live as people who are free. Now this is key, and it's so fascinating to me. Peter tells them to live as though they are not under Roman rule. Act like you're free. Act like you're not part of the Roman Empire. But specifically because of that freedom, obey them. He says, live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Now, because you're servants of God, you'll be loyal to Rome. You'll pay your taxes, right? You won't jaywalk. You'll do whatever is needed. You'll celebrate the good that's present in Rome. But the motive for that submission is not because we find our identity in being Roman. It's specifically because we find our identity in being citizens of somewhere else, of being citizens of heaven. And that's not anti-Roman, anti-Babylon, anti-American. It just says that there's a higher calling for us as disciples. That's going to look like loyalty and subversion. And you can see that in the last verse we'll read here in 1 Peter 2, verse 17. Honor everyone. Love the brotherhood. Fear God. Honor the emperor. Now, Peter packed so much into these four little commands. For our purposes, we'll focus on the first and last phrases here. The last phrase, honor the emperor. Now, that is stunning. If you really step back and think about it, the emperor was not a good guy. The emperor, if you read some of the accounts of who the emperors were, they were terrible people. They were people that were just breathtakingly wicked. But Peter says to honor that emperor. It makes sense, given what we've talked about with Jesus' ethic and Jeremiah and Daniel's ethic. So honor the emperor. As stunning as that is, do that. But to me, what's even more fascinating about this is the first phrase of the verse. Honor the emperor is where he ends. Honor everyone is where he begins. So he tells them to honor Caesar, but to honor the slave in the same way. Yes, honor Caesar, but honor the slave. If the emperor were to read this, he'd be at least confused. He'd be shocked. He probably would be irate. Because, wait, you're supposed to be honoring me higher than anyone else. I am God. Remember, he's a deity to them. Whose picture is on the coin? That's me, right? You're supposed to honor me, not the slave. So the Christians were loyal, but subversive. And they changed the world. They honored everyone like they honored him. And that's not necessarily easy, to walk in this tension between submission and subversion, really to want the best for people who hurt you, who disagree with you, that you're different from. Sometimes it's hard, really to want the best for them. But in this time of exile, we are called to live as God's people have always lived. Jeremiah, Daniel, Jesus, Peter, and now us. We're called to live like those people. I want us to close in Hebrews, just with two more texts that I couldn't leave out as we're thinking about this. Hebrews 11 and Hebrews chapter 13. Turn to Hebrews with me, because I want you to see this in your Bible as we think through how God's people have always lived like this. And this is how we are called to live as well. This is a powerful text in Hebrews 11, beginning in verse 13. It says, "These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking out a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city." As we live in this ethic, I want you to take that phrase into you, as I try to do it for me. God is not ashamed to be called their God. God is not ashamed to be called your God or mine. He's prepared for us a city, the New Jerusalem. Speaking of cities, the text in Hebrews 13 is Hebrews 13, 12 through 16. This is talking about Jesus. And I want to tie it in with that thought of city from Hebrews 11. Because what we can grasp onto from there is that we have this city that's waiting for us. For when heaven and earth are united together forever, as Paul says the end of the story is, and as John says in Revelation, heaven and earth together as one. When that happens, when we finally enter into that holy city, the New Jerusalem, we will finally be out of exile. Notice the parallel here with Jesus. Beginning in verse 12 of chapter 13, Jesus also suffered outside the gate, outside of the city. He suffered in exile, in order to sanctify the people through his own blood. Therefore, let us go to him outside the camp. Let us go join him in exile and bear the reproach he endured. For here we have no lasting city, but we seek the city that is to come. Through him, then, let us continually offer a sacrifice of praise to God, that is, the fruit of lips that acknowledge his name. Do not neglect to do good and to share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God. Like we talked about last week, one of the things that is very not satisfying about this ethic is that it doesn't answer our questions. It doesn't tell us how we should act in specific situations in our modern world that are complicated and new, and what do we do about them. It doesn't answer all of our questions comprehensively, but it gives us a framework to work through them. And here in this text, I think we get some hints as to two things that are both loyal and subversive at the same time. He ends with them. First is worship. What we do in this room is one of the most subversive actions we can possibly do. Because when we come together to praise God, we are actively, vocally saying and acknowledging and living out that we have an allegiance that's higher than anything here on earth. Higher than our country, higher than our families, higher than you name it. We have an allegiance that's higher than that, right? That's subversive. But also, he says, don't neglect to do good and to share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God. So as we're in exile here on earth, and I don't want to give us a martyr complex where our suffering, whatever our suffering might be here on earth, in terms of persecution from the culture, it's almost certainly never going to equate what these people were going through. So I don't want to give us a martyr complex like that, but I do want us to appreciate that here on earth, we can identify as being outside the city, as being with Jesus in his exile. And as we're here, let's do good. Let's share sacrificially like Jesus did. Give of ourselves to bless the people around us. Even people that hurt us, are different from us, disagree with us. Let's give ourselves to them, for them. Because we're giving ourselves to and for and through God himself. Tonight, if you need to make the first steps in a life of discipleship, in a life of doing good and worshiping with Jesus here at Exile on earth, won't you please do it as we stand and sing together?